Welcome to the quick recap of structural equation modeling for today's lecture. Structural equation modeling is derived from two strings of statistical analysis, econometrics and psychonometrics. Econometrics has been concerned with regression approaches. Regressions can model the influence of variable A on variable B. Psychonometrics is captured, for example, in confirmatory factor analysis. Here, we are interested how a set of indicators, for example, symptoms, basically help to explain an underlying concept, for example, a disease. And path analysis, that's what we will get into in the first part of this recap. We will now talk about different kinds of structural relationships. All research starts with a conscious or unconscious hypothesis. It is important to invest some thought into that, because statistical analysis can rarely correct for bad hypotheses. Looking into education level and income, it is found that a higher education correlates with a higher income. Similarly, driving a Saab correlates with higher intelligence. Now it's important to invest some thought on causality here. Does driving a Saab make you more intelligent? Or, for whatever reason, more intelligent people have a higher probability to choose a Saab? We can always think about these causalities. For education even, you may argue that a higher income leads to a higher education for the next generation, maybe also for the generation that receives the higher income. However, chronology and common thought will help you to set up the hypothesis. Another thing to think about in terms of structural relationships is the effect mechanism. How does it actually happen that two variables are correlated, education level and income? It might be that the ones making the decision on the salary feel that somebody with a higher education level has a higher value of their labor, and that again will then lead to a higher income. The next structural relationship we will look into I refer to as phantom relationship, although there are different wordings in the literature. Looking into the consumption of chocolate per capita and Nobel Prize winners per capita, empirical data can find a strong correlation here. So now the question is whether that relationship is really true, because statistically we can confirm it. However, when you think longer about it, it would make sense to think that capital assets increase funding for research, as well as capital assets increase income and thereby the potential of consumption of chocolate. These kind of relationships are not necessarily causal. And there's the moderation relationship that gets increasingly popular in statistical analysis. Going back to the example of education and income, we will see that gender can moderate the education effect on income. This means that a higher education leads to a higher income, particularly for men. For women, this effect is discounted. Next, we will talk about mediation relationships. For that, we look into a study from 2015 where they're interested in why women donate more than men in charity settings. The study confirmed this finding, but they also controlled for empathy. They allowed for effect mechanism of gender on donation behavior through empathy. When they modeled that, they saw that women had on average a higher empathy, and then higher empathy led to a higher donation behavior. The interesting finding here is also that we find full mediation in the sense that gender can no longer significantly explain donation behavior. So they adopt a model like the one on the lower right, where gender is fully mediated by empathy in terms of its influence on donation behavior. There are different kinds of mediation. More common is the complementary mediation, that it can only part of this phenomenon. There's also competitive mediation. One example would be that we assume women have a lower income, and a lower income leads to a lower donation behavior, then that would be a significant pathway mechanism that leads to competitive mediation. And of course, there's also the possibility of no mediation, as soon as one error is blocked, meaning that either women don't have a higher empathy than men on average, or a higher empathy does not lead to a higher donation behavior. When you are faced with justifying your statistical analysis approach, it is good to remember the advantages of structural equation modeling. Here we will look at the one for path analysis. The first one is that you can actually identify initial effects. An intervention may not be able to influence a behavior. Picture the theory of plant behavior. The behavior is subject to a lot of constraints and complexity. So for several reasons, an intervention might not be successful to actually change a behavior, but it may influence the intention. So instead of concluding that an intervention is not successful, you can actually conclude that it influences the intention and that now we need an intervention that can help to bridge the intention-behavior gap. Therefore, it helps you to understand an effect mechanism. It can also help you to understand parallel relationships. For example, perceived behavioral control influences intention and behavior at the same time. It can help you to understand mediator and moderator relationships, and it will help you to test entire theories, therefore modeling some of the complexity that the real life holds. Next, we will move to a new topic, latent variables, the important concept of structural equation modeling. Unlike gender, where individuals are aware of their own state, for many concepts they are not. Imagine racism, quality of life, intelligence. It's not advisable to ask individuals directly whether they are racist, whether they feel they have a high quality of life, or whether they think they are intelligent. It is, however, advisable to go with indicators. For quality of life, that could be wealth and health. For intelligence, it can be a set of questions that make up the intelligence. And there are other abstract concepts that are complex or can be differently understood between individuals. Confidence, extroversion, wisdom, sustainable behavior, welfare. It is again advisable to work with indicators. Look into different behaviors and condense them into a concept such as confidence. Thereby, latent variables reduce the dimensionality because they condense many indicators into one concept. They also reduce the measurement error. For example, for quality of life, if you would just go with a proxy such as wealth, you might not accurately measure quality of life. And of course, you can generalize concepts, therefore help knowledge creation focused on specific concepts. Structural equation modeling allows for two types of concept measurements, formative and reflective. Two examples are given here. Alcohol blood level. Beer consumption, wine consumption, liquor consumption, they make up the alcohol blood level. If we would measure the consumption of them, they are the causal reasons for a higher alcohol blood level. But we could also look into something more reflective of a high alcohol blood level. We could look at the ability to drive or the ability to balance. The same can be done for healthy food choices. We can again look into the food choices themselves, what they are made up of, low salt, low sugar, high fiber, or we can look into outcomes of healthy food choices, average BMI or healthy blood parameters. A few key distinctions for formative and reflective measurements. The direction of causality is always from the indicator to latent variables for the formative concepts. For the reflective ones, it's vice versa. For the formative one, there's no reason to expect indicators to be correlated. If we look into alcohol blood level, there's no reason to assume that liquor consumption is correlated with your beer consumption. Although in reality it might be, it mustn't. But on the other hand, the ability to walk a straight line and the ability to balance, they should correlate. So dropping an indicator from a formative model is actually inducing a measurement error. For a reflective model, that may not be the case. If you have sufficient indicators, you may not need an additional indicator anymore. If you want to assess a reflective measurement model, it's important to remember the concepts of reliability and validity. Much like in natural science, we not only want valid measures, we also want reliable measures. By reliable measures, we mean that the indicators are reliable in the sense that their measures highly correlate. It's not that we have one time that measure and the next time a totally different one. Just like a repetition of measures that all reflect a concept, they should be highly correlated. For validity, it's important to remember that we can have a valid measure without having reliability, but to actually accept a measurement of a concept, we seek both, like we have here on the fourth target, where the measures of the indicators is reliable and valid. In practice, there are few statistics that you can use to assess reliability and validity. For concept reliability, Cronbach alpha is probably the most prominent one, but there are others like Dijkstra, Hensler, Rowe that can also be used to assess the concept reliability. It refers to the fact that all the different indicators strongly correlate with each other. For validity, there's actually two types of validities, convergence and discriminant validity. Convergent validity is very similar to the concept of average variance extracted in a factor analysis. The idea is that the concept that you derive with can explain most of the variance in the indicators it is derived from. Discriminant validity is very similar in the sense that it builds on the AVE and says that a latent variable should explain variance of its own indicators measured by AVE better than indicators of other latent variables within the model. Indicator reliability is another option to go for reliability measurements where you look at squared factor loadings. Assessing a formative measurement model is a different story. Here, three statistics are commonly looked at. Indicator relevance, that basically ensures that all indicators play a role into causally describing a concept. Multicollinearity, which is about how different indicators explain different variants of a dependent variable. They may also explain the same kind of variance to a large degree, which means they have to share the explanatory power, which can lead to a modeling issue. And there's external validity that has to be thought of when designing the study and actually implementing it. Here, the idea is that we set up a formative measure and a reflective one. Looking into quality of life, we know that wealth and health can be formative indicators of quality of life, but it should also correlate to reflective measurement of the common understanding of quality of life, meaning that if we directly ask people what the quality of their life is, it should correlate with our formative concept of quality of life. Let us now quickly move to an empirical example. The example is based on the value belief norm theory collected in survey data. The value belief norm theory hypothesizes that values such as altruistic, egoistic, and biospheric values significantly influence the norm, particularly ecological norms. But this relationship is mediated by certain kind of beliefs. Here, two beliefs are given. the ecological worldview, and the perceived ability to reduce the threat. Now we use structural equation modeling to estimate the different relationships that the value belief norm theory hypothesizes. We have the egoistic values, altruistic values, and biospheric values that are based on indicators that are again based on certain questions in the survey. We have the same for ecological worldview, and here we modeled the influence on the ability to avoid fruits and vegetable imports, the norm to avoid fruits and vegetable imports, and the actual behavior. The structural relationships between the different concepts are referred to as the inner model. The measurement model of the different concepts, how the indicators make up a concept, is called the outer model. The structural equation modeling was executed with reflective measurements of the different concepts. When we look into construct reliability, we will see that all concepts have sufficient reliability. That is estimated with the rule of thumb that the Kronbach alpha should be larger than 0.7 and Dijkstra-Hensela rho also larger than 0.7. This holds for all the different concepts in our model. Looking into convergent validity, we'll find that for most concepts we have sufficient convergence validity. For the single indicator concepts, we have it by default. However, they can still suffer from measurement error to a significant degree. For the egoistic concept, we slightly missed the threshold of 0.5, but accept it for convenience reasons. Next, we look into discriminant validity. Here we will see with the Fauna-Laka criteria that all concepts can explain their own indicators better than they can explain the indicators of any other concept in the model. Therefore, we accept that we have sufficient discriminant validity. If we would not, we would need to consider merging concepts or dropping entire constructs. Once the measurement model is established, you can continue to assess the structural model. Here we start with path coefficients, a key outcome of your statistical analysis. PLS standardizes them. If x changes by 1 standard deviation, y changes by b standard deviations, with b being the path coefficient. For example, if egoistic values are modeled upon egoistic values, you would find that an increase of 1 standard deviation in egoistic values leads to an increase of exactly 1 standard deviation in egoistic values measured as a dependent variable. This holds as long as everything else is kept constant. You can immediately interpret the sign of the path coefficient. The ability to avoid imported fruits and vegetables is positively related to the norm to avoid imported fruits and vegetables. And that again is has a negative impact on the behavior or the amount purchased of imported fruits and vegetables. You can also interpret the relative effect size, and so that you know that the ability on the norm is a stronger relationship than of norm and behavior. However, the difference may not be significant. In the literature of structural equation modeling and partially square analysis, you will also find the F-squared statistic. The idea is to be able to generalize an effect size between a variable A and B beyond the model at hand. This should be interpreted with care, because there are very different expectations of effect sizes in natural science and social science, even within social sciences. This is not as valid as a relative analysis within your model, or at least an analysis of data that has been collected in a similar way. When assessing whether the path coefficient that you just modeled is also significantly different from 0, you can use the technique of bootstrapping. Instead of assuming that the data is normally distributed, you create your own distribution. Imagine that you collected a sample of 1,000 observations. They are unbiased, in the sense that if you would multiply them with 1,000, you should get an unbiased estimate of the whole population if the population were 1 million observations. Now you could also randomly select 1,000 observations 1,000 times from your sample, and you would still get an unbiased estimate of the population. Now this holds the advantage that you get 1,000 more samples, and the path coefficient that you already know from the previous modeling will change with all the different samples that you drew. For the first one, where you have like 2 times observation 5 in there and 0 times observation 9, for example, for this kind of sample of 1,000 people, the path coefficient was 0.51, or the next one 0.46, or the next one 0.43. So with this technique, you basically get a variance because you do this 1,000 times and you get a variance of the path coefficient. So you will see how likely it is that the path coefficient is actually 0 or lower than 0. And on the other hand, you will learn how likely it is that it's significantly higher than 0. This technique is used to have no assumption of normality. In the literature, it is recommended to use about 1,000 bootstraps, meaning that you do this 1,000 times, but it's automated, no worries. To assess the performance of a model, R-square or the regression coefficient is often referred to. However, it has many limitations. An obvious one for structural equation modeling is that it cannot handle path analysis. It can be an indication of how well the variance is explained by direct relationships. Here we have egoistic values, altruistic values, and biospheric values that explain 31.4% of the variance in the eco-worldview, but it cannot globally measure the model performance in the sense of how the overall model performed versus other models. For the global model performance, you can refer to the standardized root mean square residual. It's advised to be lower than 0.08 to have a sufficient model performance. You can also look, which is getting more popular, the Q-square predictive relevance. Here the idea is blindfolding. You systematically delete certain outcomes and try to predict them. To recap the recap, I want to go back to the main reasons for using structural equation modeling. I hope all of them became clear during my presentation. The first one was that with structural equation modeling you can identify initial effects and you are not always constrained by actually finding an effect on the final behavior. So you can understand effect mechanisms on how a variable A influences a variable B if there's a C mediator. You can understand parallel relationships, you can understand moderator versus mediator relationships, you can test entire theories. You can also measure a structural relationship of latent concepts, especially in survey data where such direct questioning may not be appropriate. And you can report on multiple hypotheses in one model, which is convenient to report on your findings. And it is robust to non-normal data because it draws on econometric approach of bootstrapping. 3 main takeaways. It is important to understand the structural relationship you hypothesize. That will be the most important determinant of a successful data analysis. Then measure the concepts as good as possible. That refers to the data collection stage. And provide evidence for it with structural equation modeling because it can conveniently do so. Thanks for listening and good luck with your research.